I didn't bring my baseball bat that says, you know, the inscription on my baseball bat at home actually says information security motivational device. And it actually works pretty good. So this is Bruce Marshall. He's been with us before. And he has the website, his website is passwordresearch.com. And I always refer to Bruce as our, like, you know, the world community of password crackers. I always refer to Bruce as our personal librarian. If you're looking for a paper that has anything to do with passwords and authentication, he probably has that paper on his website, and he can tell you exactly what you need for your PhD or whatever it is. And by that, Bruce?
Thanks, Bear.
Yeah.
As he mentioned, I was here last year, got to speak about password. Well, I actually spoke about security questions at the Passwords 13 conference and what happens, looking at some password database dumps that included security questions, what happened when people are left to write their own, and how that's generally a pretty terrible thing. But my first password experience in Las Vegas was actually in 1996. I was at DEF CON 4, and it was very early in my career. I was still learning a lot about information security. And I decided on the DEF CON network, which was mostly people bringing hubs and cables and stringing things together, that I wanted to log in and check my email while I was there. And I decided that Telnet was the way to do this. This is before the wall of sheep, and this was, like I said, I didn't have quite the best grasp of what that meant. I knew that Telnet could expose your password, but here was my thinking. I figured if I type the wrong password in twice and then type my right password in, they won't get to the point where they try that one, so I'll be good. As you might guess, within about a week's time, someone logged into my account, and luckily didn't cause too much damage. But that was an important lesson for me in passwords and passwords exposure to risk, and something we're going to talk a little bit more detail about today, specifically with password expiration as a way to manage that. I'm going to ask for a very basic level of participation, if you don't mind. Is that not plugged in? It may not be super loud, but it is on. We'll see if that, I don't know if that'll help at all. Just with a show of hands, and I'm not going to call anybody specifically, so you don't have to worry about being embarrassed, but who here already has what they can consider a fairly set opinion on password expiration, whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether it's useful? Just with a raise of hands. Okay? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and I'll see if my expectations meet yours and vice versa. So we pretty much we'll start with kind of the basics here and go into specifically some studies on passwords and password history. But we kind of have, starting kind of at a top level, we can probably all agree, which is where if you have a password that's compromised, it needs to be changed. Password expiration kind of pushes into the areas of the next two steps below, which is a little bit more controversial to probably more controversial, which is if you suspect it could have been like you think that something looks strange on your account when you log in, or if you see some other signs, that's a good time to change your password. Probably, again, not terribly controversial. And then finally, when it's just been, you've used it long enough, it's been out there in the world, you've telnet it in from DEF CON, you don't know for sure that it's been compromised, but there's a good chance of it. If just that chance if there's just enough of that chance, that should be a reason to change it. And that's, again, probably what we're here to talk about today as far as being the more controversial of those options. Of course, there's one more that's not on here, which is after password's been used once, you should change it, in which case you're probably looking at a technical product that's going to implement that for you. So I don't know how well you guys can see that, but I kind of tried to outline over the time of the password. It differs from password. A password system to system. You've kind of got this timeline of exposure, this timeline of risk that changes when it talks, just by going through the regular use that each user is going to have specific to theirs. So I've got, the top example here, which is on this day, I think July 1st, the user selects a password, they write down the password so they can remember it, and then they log in for the first time with the password. The next day, same thing, it's a little bit covered up here, but they log in with the password. Day 3, they mistype their password, they're not really paying attention, just typing in, and they accidentally type it in the username box. you're going to have this lifetime of different exposures that can happen that may or may not cause that password to be compromised, but definitely increase the likelihood of that happening. Of course, other passwords, I've got systems that are very similar to this one where you go maybe logging in only every couple months. There aren't really any suspicious activities, or you're not coming from somewhere that's an untrusted network. You're not writing that password down or sharing it with anybody. So there's differences when it comes to the passwords and the threats we face. So a lot of times when it comes to password expiration, as we'll talk about, we focus a lot on password cracking as that threat. And as I've kind of tried to basically show here, password cracking, of course, isn't the only threat we have to worry about. It's just one of the easier ones to measure. So the question is, if someone knows that they've done something suspicious, logging in from DEF CON over Telnet, and someone advised me of that or advised a person of that, are they going to change their password? And there's been a couple studies on this. One's, I guess, Cyber Systems, I think, is one of our sponsors here. They did a study 2 years ago where they actually just surveyed people. They asked them, hey, if you were in this situation where a system you were using, probably on the internet, had been hacked, how long do you wait before changing your password? And so they surveyed what people, what their responses were. Like all good surveys, it's kind of take it with a grain of salt. People either sometimes think they're going to do something that they really wouldn't do when it comes down to it. But we also have data on how that really plays out. Earlier this year, the University of Delaware, as a response to the Heartbleed issue, because they had some vulnerable servers, decided that they would email their students and staff and say, please change your primary network password. After 2 weeks after sending that email out, they had several thousand students and staff that had complied. But as you can see here, they had about 57% of the student body and staff left that hadn't changed their passwords. And I would, depending on the situation, I might be among that group. There was passwords I didn't go out and change all my passwords on the internet when Heartbleed came out, unless there was some significant risk. But it does show, again, that sometimes people, even when told to do certain things for what they may, from an authority figure, they're not always going to comply. And then finally, the eBay breach that happened earlier this year, where they're encrypted and hashed, or however you want to interpret that, security password database was breached. Again, customers weren't forced to change their password. They were emailed at their registered email account and asked to change their password. This is a little bit maybe CEO speak when it comes to what this really means, but essentially their CEO said about 9 weeks after the breach that 85% of their buyers who were responsible for, or the buyers representing 85% of their volume of purchases had changed their password. So it's essentially the people that are on there the most, making the most purchases. People like me that hardly ever get on eBay, not among that group. So you kind of have a feel for, yes, sometimes people are going to cooperate, especially when they're specifically told that their password has been compromised or has been at risk, but it's not a perfect solution. So that's where, well, okay. So we're going to talk a little bit then about the timelines. How long, in some different types of scenarios, do you have to change your password, or do you have to notice that there's a breach and know that you need to change your password? So we'll go over a few of those. The Onion, America's finest news source, had a little incident with the Syrian Electronic Army last year where a couple of their employees fell victim to a phishing attack. So first day, Syrian Electronic Army people sent out emails to several Onion staffers to go to this website, and then once they got to the website, they were prompted for their Google app credentials. Only one person, according to the Onion, then later went and wrote this up, which is how we have this information. But only one person responded to that. But because of that, they were able to get into that person's account, and then from the internal email through Google Apps, they were able to send out more phishing emails that looked a little bit more convincing, came from a more trusted source, and they were able to get further account compromise. Now the dates on here, I'm not exactly sure of. They didn't specifically, they blogged about this, they didn't specifically label what the time frame was, but at the end, the suggestion seems to be that it was within a very short time frame. So maybe that day, maybe the next day. But again, they basically got into social media accounts because they had access to the people's accounts from there. And then even after the Onion staff had realized that there was a compromise going on and sent out emails to people saying, reset your password. The SEA actually forged a copy of that message to sending it to everybody but IT and said, yes, reset your password, go to this link to do it. And that allowed them further continued access to the social media account. So that's a very short, within a couple days time frame of they were staying fairly on top of getting the credentials, using the credentials, escalating the attack. Another example is a couple years ago in 2012, the South Carolina Department of Revenue was hit with an attack that Mandy had written up and kind of provided some detail on that. Again, it started with a phishing attack sent to employees. The credentials that they got from that phishing attack, at least one set they were able to use to get into the internal network then and start looking around the network. But it took them around 15 days, according to the logs and the records that Mandy had access to. Within another couple days, they stole more passwords. And then finally, on day 20, they stole probably the Active Directory password database, and then also finally got that backdoor installed. And this is an important distinction, too, because sometimes when you hear about people protesting password expiration, they say, well, it doesn't make sense to have password expiration because as soon as they get in, they're going to install the backdoor. Well, that's not always possible. I mean, that's a very valid point in some cases. In other cases, there's no backdoors to be installed. Limiting their continued access is going to have some value. Finally, kind of worst case scenario. This was a few years ago back. The Israel Institute of Technology, one of the directors for one of their centers there, had a password, and I guess in some sort of a news article, a hacker was showing off that he had these elite skills, and so he showed how he could log into this person's university account. Apparently, the reporter followed up with the director and did confirm that it's been 4 years that apparently the hacker just been holding on to it. Maybe he'd been logging in, reading email. Didn't go into details on what was actually happening in that time frame, but there wasn't an active, noticeable attack during that time. Otherwise, she probably would have changed her password. So different scenarios. We try, in many cases, to try to deal with all of those using password expiration as a primary lines of defense, or one of our lines of defenses. And there's really two goals we try to accomplish with password cracking, password expiration. The first is that we want this to occur before the compromise happens, ideally. Now, that's not always possible. Certainly, forced password expiration is also a step in incident response plans if you want to make sure that the attackers no longer have access to the passwords. The secondary goal that's also very important, and that we're going to be going into a little bit more detail today on, is you don't want the new password to be so similar to the old one that you really haven't gained anything with forcing people to change it. And that's a little bit harder, especially to enforce from a security standpoint. As you guys probably know, most of these are enforced through policies within the software. Usually it's set for a certain time, so 90 days, 6 months. There's occasionally, very rarely, I'll see systems that say you have a limited number of uses, maybe 100 logins before you have to change your password or something like that. There's also two ways to implement it from how do you get people to or change their passwords. You can either give them what's called a grace login. So like with Windows Active Directory, if my password expires, I can still log in with that password. I'm just forced immediately to change it. That's kind of a grace login standpoint. That tends to preserve usability more because people aren't getting completely locked out. They have that opportunity to log in and set their password up. But of course, that also, if there was a reason you wanted them to not log in with that password anymore, you've kind of extended that security boundary maybe past what you're really comfortable with. But of course, the downside of the other approach of locking them out completely if they haven't changed their password by that point is that you have to communicate that up front very well. And you also have people that are not going to do it, and you're going to have more help desk or self-service calls related to that. Typically, because you introduce password expiration, there's some other controls that kind of go along with them. Password history is one of those. You don't have to have password history if you're forcing users to type in their current password and their new password at the same time. The system can do some checking between those two without storing the old one in a history somewhere. But generally, if you're more serious about making sure people aren't reusing passwords, which we don't want them to do, you are going to be storing those passwords, either usually hashed, within your account database somewhere. And then when they change those passwords, you're checking against all your hashing what they chose, and check it in against all those other previous results to see if they are indeed using something that they've already used before. Sometimes this will be 4 times. Sometimes people will just say, hey, we want to prevent them from reusing passwords for a year. Beyond that, we don't really care. It really depends on the implementation. Minimum password age is another one of those you'd think doesn't make a lot of sense until you realize that once password expiration was introduced and password histories came into play, now a few people, probably not very many, are looking for ways to get around that. And what they were doing was essentially if their password history was 10 passwords, they would change their password 10 times to get back to what they had, push everything out of the password history stack, and then get back to their original password. Like I said, whether that was just the technologically knowledgeable crowd that was doing that, I don't think a lot of people were. But so this essentially says you can set it a day, you have to wait a day before a person can change their password. And again, some people have criticized that from a security standpoint, saying, well, if something did happen in that time frame of them changing their password within a day, they can't lock someone out of their account. Probably not a very likely scenario, but it could happen. And finally, the change notifications. The idea behind this is to give users a chance to say, I'm going to change my password when it's convenient with me within this window, within this notification window. So if it's 2 weeks or if it's a week, they're going to have the opportunity to say, you know what, I don't want to wait till Monday morning, first thing, to change my password. I'm going to take care of it today, and then it'll be out of the way, and I won't have to worry about it. Especially when you have the account lockout. If they reach the password expiration date, this becomes very important. And NIST, one of the NIST password management documents we'll talk about here in a few minutes, also really strongly recommends this. But the idea that some people have suggested that this notification gives people time to start this creative process of coming up with a new password, which I'm not sure really takes that. I mean, it's not really something you start and think about and kind of mull over for a long time. It pretty much happens within a few minutes once you're finally making the decision to change it. So where do some of the guidelines, what are some of the popular sources of that say we should enforce password expiration? And while it wasn't the first, it was one of the better documented ones and certainly became one of the earliest ones, which was the U.S. Department of Defense's password management guide, which is the lime green book in the Rainbow book series. They essentially kind of established that, first of all, yes, you should change passwords before they are compromised, before the probability of compromise, and they also kind of established the idea of working out a maximum lifetime. And they actually say, hey, 1 year is probably sufficient in most cases. And for us to think, hey, 30 days or 90 days or whatever, that seems like that's a big change. But also the time, of course, 1985 was when this came out. Times were very different back then. In fact, if you look at the appendix where they're calculating how strong the password should be and how long the lifetime should be, they're making calculations based on the number of possibilities, of course, which is still something we do today. If you have 8-character password of uppercase, lowercase numbers and symbols, how many probabilities you have to guess before you get through that complete set. But they were doing it figuring a 300 baud and a 1200 baud modem, which gives you about 8.5 and 14 guesses per minute. It's very different from the 10 billion guesses per second we can get now if we're actually talking about password cracking as opposed to online password guessing. Even online password guessing is faster than that. So that established the baseline, but we've had other organizations that have kind of picked up on the idea of password aging and thrown in their own 2 cents on how it should be done. And I don't want to exhaustively go over these, but we'll kind of touch on some highlights of some of the more popular ones. When Windows NT 4 had password expiration in it, but there wasn't a default. You set essentially what value you wanted when you enabled that policy. 2000 was the same way. It was off by default, but it defaulted to 42 days once you turned it on, unless you chose to change it. And they had a little bit of fractured feedback when it came to the way that they suggested what was the suggested value for that. Depending on what source you looked at, one of their papers, and of course the default was 42. Others said, hey, you're good with 90 if you're in high security, 180 if you're not. Some said 70. So it wasn't that. I'm sure since then they've kind of gotten a little bit better about standardizing their advice, but that was a big pressure, especially for organizations in corporate environments, and moving to password expiration. It made it very easy to get on board with some of those values. A couple others, the PCI Council for people who deal with bank cards, the major brands. not the users themselves. So my Amazon, if I log into Amazon for a credit card, I'm not changing my password every 90 days, but the people that manage those systems are supposed to in certain cases, depending on what type of structure they fit into the PCI standards. SANS also had, there's critical security controls that they introduced in 2009 and continue to update. Since then, they say at least 90 days, but they do say something down at the bottom, which kind of mimics what we saw with the Green Book Password Management Guidelines, which is that you should still customize this based on your specific organization's environments. 90 days should be what you start with. If you have the manpower and knowledge to especially say, hey, 90 days is too often or not often enough, you should be able to customize it from there and still be in compliance with this control. HIPAA, which is a healthcare regulation in the United States on dealing with records and data exchanges. In the actual law, there's nothing specific about passwords, but in the ruling, one of the guidance documents that the Health and Human Services. Okay, hacked myself. Thought I screwed that in. They again kind of say nothing specific. They don't say 90 days, they don't say 180 days, but they do say it should happen on a periodic basis. That's something they're expecting those organizations that are required to comply with HIPAA to implement. Uh-oh. That's interesting. All right. OWASP kind of, the applicant, if you're not familiar with them, they're an organization that focuses on web application security. They do have a document which is intended for developers and people that are assessing web applications primarily, but any applications would work, that they should have a capability within any product or software to verify that passwords can expire after a certain amount of time. They're not, again, specific. They don't say that it has to be 90 days, but they do say that that functionality should be available in the application to be used. The website, which is a wiki, so anybody can really go edit it, says, of course, we're all in agreement that this is important. If you disagree with that, you're welcome to go change their mind on it. FFIEC is the organization which deals with banking regulation in the United States. And they have an IT examiner's handbook, which is then used by their assessors and the OCC, state regulators, and people like that. But you can kind of see, too, as I've kind of gone through these, I've arranged them so that you get from very specific guidance to kind of, well, you should do this, but it's not necessarily specific on how you should implement it. But they just basically say you should implement a schedule to change them on a set schedule. The NIST document that I mentioned earlier, the standard they basically set on how organizations should manage passwords. And again, they tend to have a very good balanced approach to this, which is that you need to decide whether that's important for you, but they also have to say something that's very important that I don't see in a lot of organizations that I've assessed and done work with, which is having separate password policies depending on what type of application you're trying to implement that policy in. What I normally see is one corporate information security policy that says 90 days or it says 180 days. It doesn't say, hey, for the system that you hardly ever log into, which is always over HTTPS and it's an internal system, that this policy is different from your primary domain login or something like that. Of course, the ISO 17799, the old policy that was based off the BS 7799. I have this in the older one in here just to show you the difference between this and the current policy. The language has changed a little bit. There's two sections that really apply it to password expiration. One is that the first section, which is that they say users should be told to change passwords at regular intervals. And the other one is that the password management system should enforce password changes. If we look at the upgraded version of that, the replacement version, 27002, first of all, they removed the language from the section that previously told users they should be changing their passwords regularly. And they also added the words as needed at the end of that system. So to me, that's lightening up the language a little bit, making it a little bit more acceptable not to force organizations to implement password aging if they want to comply with the standard. There's several others. The IRS has one for themselves and for state agencies that process taxes. There's one for energy regulation. Anybody familiar with COBIT? Does anybody know if COBIT has specific guidance on what passwords expiration should be? I didn't get a copy of it. That'd be the only other one that people bring that in for SOX audits and things. I'm not sure if that has specific guidance on it, but it's not just the standards that we're kind of buying into the idea of password expiration, but there was a paper, the analysis of end-user security behaviors back in 2004, which surveyed grad students in IT and asking them to rate different behaviors, everything from installing Trojan on my computer to leaving my laptop unlocked when I walk away from it. But when they evaluated the statement of didn't change their password for over 2 years, just that was the only context they got. 80% of them said that was a naive mistake. The other 20% either didn't agree or rated it, not a mistake or something else. So it's kind of interesting how, and I'm going to go into a little bit more, but how we've kind of had different perspectives on whether this is a good control or whether this is a bad control. One of the challenges we have with password expiration, and certainly with other things within information security, is that we don't have really the data we need to make some good decisions about how effective this is as a control. Ideally, we want to know how often has this password policy forced a password change, which then either prevented an attack from happening or limited the amount of time that an attacker had access to get into the system. So if we look at this from a Venn diagram perspective of the time where the password is valid versus the time that an attacker has not only the password, but also has the motive, access, skills, if you want to look at the Scram model, to actually use that password. What we probably hope is that there's very little overlap, that those password expirations are working great, the passwords are getting cycled out fast enough that we're not having much damage. The reality is it's probably more like this, but we don't know for sure. I mean, we don't have data that says that we have any real way to judge the effectiveness of the control. So it's anecdotes, it's guessing, it's looking at what little data we have, the success of phishing attacks and things to try to make sense of whether this is helpful or not. So what does the average person, the people we're implementing these policies to protect, think about changing passwords? And it's kind of funny how this is split. One study from Jane Rain said that basically 38% would rather do some household chore, scrub the toilets, clean the oven out, than come up with a new username and password. And that's not specific to password, but it is certainly, I'm sure that sentiment is shared. The other 38% think that if they don't see a website with password expiration, that's a sign that this website's not as secure as the other websites. So you've kind of got two ends of the spectrum here, the people that look at that as a valid security mechanism and they hope to see it, and the people that would really not like to change their passwords as long as possible. I really like, this is something I found last year and I thought was a great example. I love that the open nature of social media where you get people's stream of thoughts and confessionals about their different security practices, but it kind of reflects how some people, and likely a majority of people, have dealt with some types of password expiration, which is not to take it as, even though they think it's, hey, we've got to change passwords, it's probably for a good security reason, they're not looking at that second goal of making sure the password that they're choosing is different enough from their old password. So I captured several of those of people, their reflections on their own ways of going about changing passwords and what their thoughts were on that.
It's possible that someone can believe it's necessary and still prefer cleaning toilets to doing it.
That's true. They may buy into it, but just not want to actually experience that work themselves. Now, notice here that two of these say OSU. We'll come back to that here in a little while. So I kind of, over the years, I've seen a few things here and there about people kind of protesting password expiration and what their thoughts were on it. But I wanted to kind of backtrack through the years, back through the last 20, 30 years of modern, implementations of passwords and look at when did people start objecting to password expiration. It actually didn't take me very long, starting back at the beginning, even before the Lime Green book came out and the Unix operating system security book. Fred Gramp and Robert Moore Sr. were already kind of picking at least the implementation of the password expiration mechanisms they had in those systems. And there were some very specific complaints about the way that Unix was implementing those, not so much applicable to every implementation, but they did have some concerns about just how useful it was as a whole. Fred Cohen from Sandia National Labs and also kind of from the antivirus community had similar thoughts in 1997 where he looked at there wasn't much value being provided by these password expiration policies, that we were implementing them, we were putting them in place, but there wasn't much payoff from doing that. Kept looking, found a lot of different support, and I'm not going to go through each one of these, but a lot of these shared the same sentiments that either the problem with password expiration was it was happening too frequently, it was causing inconveniencing users to the point that they were getting frustrated while providing very little value. People were choosing easily guessed passwords as a replacement. People were writing down their passwords. Let's see if there's any specific. I think Gene Spafford's was probably one of the first very detailed kind of stepping through the different problems with password expiration. But I did think it was very interesting that there's Gartner. Gartner here, of course, very big in the business, some parts of the business community as far as their knowledge and wisdom, but they had written back in 2005 that there were a lot of security practices that were different from, or more effective, more value than what password aging. And in fact, I think they make a statement somewhat to the effect of there's a 0.9 probability that password aging is not going to provide you any value, and whether you believe that's has a solid basis in reality. It was saying a lot for them to come out and say that. Some more resources here coming up into the more recent years. But despite all this, a lot of what they were saying was either logical arguments, which is fine in some cases, or they were anecdotes about I'm seeing people write down, they're just incrementing the numbers at the end, or I'm seeing this, I don't believe this, which was great. But it wasn't really until 2010 when some researchers at the University of North Carolina were actually able to get a hold of data and then look at what real choices were people making if looking at password expiration and looking at the password choices that they've had in the past. And this was actually a really interesting chance. They looked at disabled accounts in their environment, so probably most likely students at this university, that had password history enabled. I think that password history did get up to 15 for some accounts, but the majority of the passwords they had the accounts they had access to only had 4 to 6 passwords stored. But that's still a pretty good variety to look into. At the university, they had changed passwords every 3 months, and they did have some basic password complexity enforced for the people that were changing their passwords. So what did they find? They first of all, they had to crack the passwords, which that does have some caveats to it because they're only analyzing the passwords they could crack. Of course, the more stronger passwords, it might skew these results in a more positive way. They weren't able to analyze as many of those, but they did a fairly good job of cracking what they had. And then they took those and they used transform-based, basically regular expressions to say, okay, we have the current password, or password 1, password x-1, password x-2, so on and so forth. How are these related? Can we create these transforms, so doing simple things like substituting a 1 for a 2 and find the new password value? And they found that after coming up with all sorts of, around, I think it's a little bit less than 550 transforms, everything from substituting numbers to inserting things to leet speak translations, pretty much what you see in a lot of password cracking filters these days, that 41% of the new passwords that they had access to could be broken fairly easily. Like I said, 550 guesses. This isn't millions and millions of different cracking attempts, just knowing what the old password was. And then maybe in a more practical, and this was, at the time, they said this was about 3 seconds. If you're doing offline cracking, that was about 3 seconds of work per account. But if you're doing online guessing, password guessing, and you have someone's previous password, by using the most popular substitutions, which I believe all were number incrementing, they were able to still get 17% of passwords across the accounts they analyzed. So that was pretty important. One of the problems of this paper, or one of my perceived problems of this paper, was it had lots of Greek symbols in it. It had lots of tables of data. It had lots of information which was not easily digestible by the average IT practitioner. So while they did have summaries of things like this, you had to really dig through the paper, and it wasn't as easily relatable to the average person. So that'd be my one critique of the paper, but it was great data that they shared. So I have a little bit of data that I'm going to be able to share, some passwords that I've looked at in 2 different environments. I unfortunately haven't gotten quite to the point where I have as much detail as what they had in the UNC case study, but I'm working towards that point. There's one environment where I was able to go back 3 times over a 3-year period, actually on the same month every year, extract the passwords, crack the passwords. The nice thing about this being an Active Directory environment was they had landman hashes enabled, NTLM. You can essentially crack 99%, 100% of the passwords, depending on if anybody chose 15 characters or longer. You don't get those, but pretty much everything else you're going to get. So I was able to crack the majority of these, which gave me greater access to the passwords for comparison. There wasn't any password expiration at all. People were essentially just allowed to keep their passwords as long as they wanted to, or until they ran into a problem that required a password change. And the minimum, believe it or not, the minimum length was 3, which that blew my mind, but that was their policy at the time. So over that 3-year period, looking at accounts that were there for all 3 years, I tried to look at how often do people change their passwords. And so you get some figures here, around 81 to 83% didn't change their passwords. I think it was 77% over the 3-year period for the 1,000 some accounts that were there for all 3 years. So, not terribly surprising. People aren't going to change their passwords unless they have a reason to. I did look at accounts that had at least 2 different passwords, and of course, since these were snapshots in time and not looking at the password history, I was only able to tell that they had a different password from the previous time. They may have changed it 10 times in that year's period, but of course that's fairly unlikely. So accounts with at least 3 different passwords, there was only 4% of the user base that was either voluntarily or for some reason having to change their password. This is also kind of interesting. The difference between the UNC study and this was, for those people that changed their passwords, it may have been more difficult for them to choose something similar to their previous password, depending on the reason for the password change. If they had forgotten their password altogether, of course, that would have been one reason for a change, and there would have been no way for them to go back then and use something similar unless they remembered it at a later time and changed it a 3rd time. So there might have been, that's something I'm interested in seeing as far as how big of an impact that has. And I'll come back to Zulu, but I'm going to introduce Tango here. This is a slightly different end of the spectrum, where it was an organization where they had to change passwords every 30 days. Very similar in that they didn't have password complexity turned on. They did have a longer minimum length of 6 characters. But otherwise, again, Active Directory, I was able to crack 99% of the passwords that they had. But I only got 1 sample. I wasn't able to get several samples over time to compare, unfortunately. So if we start by looking at how the length compares, and I've got all 3 years of Zulu up here, but effectively they're similar to a point. You can see a couple of interesting things. First of all, that while the minimum length of Zulu was 3 characters, the majority of people still tended to choose, even though they weren't being required to by software, tended to choose longer passwords. With Tango, 20% of the users chose that minimum of 6 characters. And then it went up to close to 40%, and then about 35%, and before it sharply dropped down once you hit 9 characters. To me, that tends to say that if someone's going to have to be committing to regular password changes, they're not going to come up with some nice, long, juicy password. They're going to say, okay, what's the minimum I have to produce here? Let's get that done and go from there. But it is interesting. The other thing I thought was notable, not really specific to password expiration, but that these people who didn't have that same pressure, they could have chosen 3, 4 character passwords. They still tended not to choose, below the 6 and 7 character, with 8 being the most popular. Password mask comparison. If you're familiar again with password cracking, this is essentially just a way of simplifying, saying, okay, you know, essentially we care about whether it's a dictionary word or name or something, but let's just focus on the format at first. And so these masks represent that format of letters, not that it's a specific letter or a specific number, but how that password is formed. So this is all lowercase letters. This is 3 lowercase letters followed by 3 numbers, so on and so forth. So you can see from the third year of Zulu and the third year of Tango, the differences in the masks, and then this also tells you what % of the total passwords those were. So the first big difference you can note is that, of course, people were using a lot more just letters, lowercase letters, in the Zulu environment. And when you look at Tango, suddenly now letters are being appended on 75% of those passwords. And it's usually in the predictable format of something letters plus 1 number plus 2 numbers. And while I don't have a lot of the details on it, I can tell you from just looking at the data, there was a lot of those that were words followed by numbers. So, one hand, it's good that some of these probably were dictionary, or are definitely are dictionary words, but we're not necessarily buying as much else when we are actually looking at. Yes, you have to add a number on the end, but the numbers themselves are a little predictable too. This is a little bit busy as far as the bar graph goes, but you can kind of see this is all 3 years of Zulu and then just 1 year of Tango. This is of the numbers that those were used in those environments, what the preference was for certain specific numbers. So most popular number was 0 in Zulu. Most popular number was 1. Or sorry, Zulu was 1 and 0 was Tango. You can also kind of see how, for example, the month that I took the Tango sample was in July. So 7 has a very high popularity. 4 as the year, also very popular. So even choices like that for an attacker, especially if this is, like I said, 30 days, it's very easy to guess that the number is probably going to be associated with the current month or the past month, depending on what point in the password expiration they're in. While it's not entirely random, as you can see in the other environment, there tends to be a little bit more question as to what it's going to be. So I want to put out more data on that. Like I said, I'm not completely through with my comparison of which are the more secure, which are the least secure of those two environments. Like I said, that's my suspicion, is that there's not being a whole lot bought by password expiration. But I did like this quote from Gartner back in 2010 in one of their papers about the risk, what's motivating having password expiration in place. And this is the nice version. And then this is the rant version, also from Gartner. This is from their VP, their security practice. But there's a lot of blame being placed on auditors, which I think to an extent is fair, because they're the ones that are having to enforce the standards that are on the books or the standards that we've written in our policies. But the reality is, they can only take so much of the blame. We have responsibility as the IT security people to make sure that we're not so risk adverse. We're saying, well, if we turn off password expiration, someone could get this person's password and use it for 6 months or use it for a year. We have to be willing to accept some of that risk when it makes sense, not in every case. It's also very easy if you work in internal IT, if you've inherited policies or practices that came from 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or just to let those stay on the books the way that they are today. Unless there's some big pain point, there's not a lot of motivation to go try to fight those battles of getting it changed, going through the audit committees, going through external audit that's going to come in and flag that as an issue every time, and trying to fight those battles. What I do think is interesting, and what some of the objections, like Fred Cohen points out in his paper, that one of the areas that password expiration can make sense is in shared password environments, where if you have 5 people with a service password that they have to share for some reason. It may not be a great practice, but they have to do it. That having password expiration in that place, because there's diffused responsibility among those people, can actually have some benefits. And especially in smaller environments where they don't have, where you can't sit down and say, do a risk assessment of password expiration, having that turned on versus nothing can have benefits in some cases. So again, it's not a cut and dry case of get rid of password expiration. It's more of make sure it's being used in the right situations and that it makes sense. So has there been a shift? I mean, like I said, there's more attention being given to password expiration, more people going on, writing their opinion that, hey, I don't agree that password expiration is great. There's certainly been a number of organizations. Here's a sample of a few of them. What's interesting is sometimes password expiration policies are being tied to other password policy changes, such as in the case of Northern Illinois University, where they said, we're going to increase the duration of passwords, but we're also going to increase the minimum length. Stanford changed their password policy earlier this year to say, we're also going to increase the minimum length, but you'll not have to use as many complex characters. So people are kind of tying it into that. I also thought universities are very easy to witness this happen in, because they typically have published policies that are accessible on the internet. Sometimes they have bulletins that are sent out to their students and teachers. But it is interesting to see that even the U.S. Defense and Finance and Accounting Service announced that they're also increasing the duration of how long the passwords are good for. If you remember that OSU story, OSU had a 90-day password. Oklahoma State University had a 90-day password expiration. And I don't know why, but they were getting a lot of hatred for it, especially on Twitter. What was kind of funny was this guy, Bob Gribben, in their support department, had agreed some number of years ago to put his name on the password expiration notices that were mailed out to the students and teachers. So he apparently was getting a good deal of hate, whether it was serious or not. And this was earlier January of this year. Just last month, OSU announced that they are changing their password expiration from 90 to 180 days. So, which leads me to believe that even though, again, it's not necessarily turning off expiration or making it into a year or whatever, that giving it attention, just bringing it to the forefront and saying, well, why do we have this policy? Does it make sense to have this? In his case, because he was getting negative attention, that sometimes can stimulate discussions about changing the password policies. So what are your alternatives? If you decide, okay, Bruce, I'm ready to loosen up our password expiration or turn it off altogether, what am I going to tell auditors, or what am I going to tell my boss, or what am I going to tell other people when it comes to what our alternatives are? What else are we doing to try to stop password compromise from having big problems in our environment? Of course, the easiest one is to only force changes when compromise is suspected, or if you change your password policy, if you go from 7 characters to 8 characters, people aren't going to be forced to do that unless you actually stimulate a password change. But one of the more popular ones that I think is going to start getting a lot more attention is the intrusion prevention coupled with behavioral profiling of users. And there have been products in the market for years, but I've seen a lot more. IBM filed a bunch of patents this year. There's several companies out there marketing these right now where, especially for online services, the way you move your mouse or the way you click through applications or the way that you react to certain stimuli fairly within the normal navigation of the application can be used to profile you as a user, especially, of course, coupled with, are you coming from Russia? Are you coming from China when you normally come from somewhere else? Those types of things can kind of complement the password as a way of identifying you. This is always a good one, too, better feedback to users. If you say your last login was from here, or hey, you're sending an email because your password was just changed, these are things that can help users in an intelligent way give us feedback on whether something is happening that shouldn't be happening because someone's gotten their password. And of course, this is easier said than done, but if you have a situation where you're saying, listen, we've got to change passwords every 30 days or 60 days because we just can't stand password compromise happening, we've got to try to prevent it in all cases, you probably need to be looking at something multi-factor. And like I said, it's easier said than done. Some systems make that very difficult to implement, but it is certainly something that you should be considering. Oh, I was going to say, to this end, if you want to write a justification for changing your password policy, Texas A&M had one, I think, a couple years ago that's out there as a PDF that they wrote up very well, uses a lot of these references, makes this case. I don't have a link to it in here, but if you let me know, I'll certainly send you a link to that PDF and give you a starting place if you're going to try to write that justification. And they actually went into password length and some other stuff too, but password expiration was one part of that. So areas where I'd like to see research needed, of course, because I'm always interested in getting more data, getting some of the information, trying to make better and smarter decisions. Like I said, we still have fairly limited on what the impacts are. Can you educate users? Like I have to change my password 60 days for one system. My passwords have nothing to do with each other. I use a diceware type system, so it's fairly easy for me to come up with new random passwords to use every time I have to have a change. And it's not too difficult for me to memorize the new ones. Is that something that's applicable to all users, or is that really something that's only going to be really helping out a certain small portion of the user base? Is there an optimal time? Like I said, 30 days, probably way too often. What about a year? If you make people change their password every year, are they going to move away from that making predictable choices, their old password being related to their new password? We don't really have data on that. And like I kind of mentioned, what are the impacts that awareness can make? This is my niece, Naja. I had to inform her recently that it was time for her to change her password. That's it. Like I said, I hope I kind of took a survey at the beginning about opinions on passwords. Anybody's opinion changed? The password expiration? Any new evidence you can use? That's really my hope. Whether you change your mind or not, at least you have some more information. But feel free to contact me. I'll put these slides up here as well as links to some of the sources that I had, because I know there was a lot that I covered as far as the different resources in here. But any questions?
For those organizations that do store X previous passwords, do you know if any of them are using positive matches on prior passwords as an input to their IDS?
So they would actually be scanning for those strings, like inbound.
In their authentication system, if an attempted
Okay.
authorization actually matched a prior password hash,
Right, to flag that as an incident.
are they feeding that into their IDS as a possible signal?
Yeah, not that I've seen. I mean, the closest I've seen to that is, I guess, Google will tell you if you try to log in with your old password that, hey, you changed this 90 days ago. So they're keeping records of that, and we'll do some basic alerting, but that's not really IDS type things. I don't think I've seen or heard of anybody that's doing that level of testing. I think it'd be an interesting idea to try out.
It would seem like a way of figuring out, is proactive rotation actually preventing, thinking back to our keynote, the B-Sides keynote, as a way of measuring the effectiveness of forced password rotation. That would be an interesting piece of data to find out how often does an old password, expired password,
Sure.
trying to be used. It seems like something I'd
Yeah.
love someone like you to do for me.
Well, I'm always, if I have the data, it's usually easier. What I have seen is that's not really specifically related to that is the blacklisting of certain passwords by organizations, of course, that they've, especially what's interesting is online games are starting to do that more. ArenaNet, and I think, I can't think of the other game, but anyway, they're basically saying, listen, we've had these million passwords that are constantly trying online against our accounts. You just can't use those anymore. But yeah, not specifically to that level what you're talking about. Like I said, I'd like to see it.
Foreshadowing my own talk, there's a big difference between changing authentication passwords. There's a big difference between changing authentication passwords and encryption passwords, where, in a sense, you've got one type of password, encryption passwords, that you should very rarely change.
Sure.
And so we're sending people a signal when we're telling them to change passwords, and then we come across a case where if people extend that advice to those other passwords, they're actually doing themselves a very big disservice.
Yep, Jim.
Are there any great worst practices stories that you have about password changes? I mean, one that kind of occurs to me that I sort of vaguely remember is a site that was checking to make sure that your password was different enough from one of your other ones, which kind of indicated that it must be storing your old passwords in the clear.
Right. Yeah, and that's actually, I'm trying to think where someone is, I see a lot of the same stuff on Twitter, you probably do, and I try to capture screenshots of interesting, I know one lady had to change her password after every database login or something. It seems like I did see one recently where it was something like someone was complaining that their password was being compared to a previous password, and it wasn't a this is the exact same thing. This is very close, and some systems of course are implemented with reversible encryption or nothing at all, where that can happen. But I don't have a specific company to name or a product or something like that. Yep. All right. Well, so go to Rick's talk and you'll hear a little bit more about that.
There's a website dedicated to researching every site which stores plaintext password, and it's called plaintextoffenders.com. And if you go there, you'll see hundreds of horror stories.
Right.
It's very common.
Plaintext Offenders is a good place to go look at seeing if either report a site you find is emailing you plaintext passwords, or to go see if one of the sites you use has that type of a setup.
My question is going to be fairly fundamental. You mentioned using Diceware, which we did to generate a master password for 1Password. And then we've used it since then to generate passwords, which are very quite strong, air quotes. When we're required to change passwords, it strikes me as odd that it should be up to us to decide if it's current enough or strong enough, or we're assuming that risk. And so that's one part of the question. And the other part is our financial institution, I just reminded him, has never, ever required us to change our passwords.
Right.
We have different logins.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You'll see, and that's a common thing I'll see people complaining about. Like Pillsbury.com requires stronger passwords than my bank does, or there's just very large inconsistencies in how that's implemented. Even
we think they salt it. I mean, we think we're doing something to it and ignoring what that base password is.
yeah, but to your first point about password, a person's password feels personal to them. And that's a very interesting thing when you think about, like, one of the very few security controls that people say, well, I had to come up with it, so therefore it's mine, even though your system required it of me. I should have more control over it. I should be able to choose what I want, or should be the length that I want. And in some systems, I think that certainly makes sense, especially lower security stuff. But
I wasn't implying that we're smart and we generated it. 1Password generated it, and we paid.
the site's not happy with because it contains certain characters, or right.
They don't know what it is, and they just want to read it.
Right. Yep. Jeff.
I've got just pure speculation about what's going on with the weak password requirements of banks. And I'd love for somebody to actually have solid research and evidence on this. I suspect that they are encouraging weak passwords because they want their passwords to be unique and not written down or stored in an Excel file, and that they believe that their hashes are never going to be compromised.
Right.
So that they've put their defenses to make sure that their hashes or whatever they're using will never be exposed. And so then they're actually lowering their password requirements on people so that people will pick unique things that they remember.
I think he wants to comment on your statement there.
I hope you've got data.
So not that I've ever worked in information security in a bank. Let me throw that. I am not a lawyer. Blah, 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 blah. Two things. One, compatibility with the back-end heavy iron that some banks have had for years. The second thing, customer comes first. We need to make it easy for them. They need to be able to get into their bank account. We don't care if it's best practice or not.
Yeah, I actually been in it.
Also on those lines, some systems require reversible encryption, so you have that as well. And as far as what you're saying about weak systems, there's only a certain number of passwords, certain number of hashes that will exist in that space. So it definitely would not be that. It would, because you want to increase the key space as much as possible.
So when you leave the business unit making the decision, which is usually probably the head of marketing or business development, what do you think decision they're going to make?
Yeah, I think in some cases too, there's not, the people that write the banking software aren't getting pressure from the customers that that's a feature that they really want. I mean, I've talked with probably about 6 or 7 different core banking. This is the foundation of your banking infrastructure, core banking software vendors, and I'm asking them, how are you hashing your passwords? And it's SHA-1, SHA-256, SHA-1 with salting. It's not what the rest of us are looking at Twitter and Facebook, having better. It's just they don't think about it. They're not asked by customers about that very often, and so I don't think it's a priority for them. Well, I appreciate everybody's time today, and if you got any other questions, certainly get in contact. Thanks.